Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night. I've been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, but nothing in that time could have prepared me for the winter I spent in the north section of the park. My cabin was tucked deep into the forest, far from the nearest ranger station, cell service non-existent, roads snowed over. It was supposed to be routine, patrol the trails, maintain the cabin, check on wildlife. But as soon as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I began to feel the forest watching me. The first night was deceptively quiet, only the creaking of the cabin and the occasional whisper of wind through the pines. I kept my rifle by the bed, the hatchet under the chair by the door, and every instinct honed from years of patrolling in remote areas told me that caution was everything. Still, as I stared into the darkness beyond the frost-covered window, I felt wrong. On the second night, it started. Faint scratches at the edge of the clearing. I shone my flashlight across the snow, but found nothing, just shadows and the skeletal shapes of the trees. I rationalized it, maybe a deer, a fox, or an overzealous raccoon. But then I heard it, a whisper. Not words, just a rasping hiss, so soft I almost convinced myself it was the wind, but my gut told me otherwise. I gripped my rifle and crept outside, scanning the snow for movement. Footprints, long, uneven, hunched, nothing human. They disappeared into the tree line. My chest tightened, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. Not the rational fear of a bear or a storm, but something older, something patient. By the third night, the whispers had grown louder, low, deliberate moans carried on the wind. Branches snapped in impossible patterns. Shadows twisted at angles that defied explanation. I began leaving small traps around the cabin, not because I thought I could stop it, but because doing something, anything, made me feel marginally safer. I reminded myself constantly that wendigos were just stories, folklore, old hunters' tales meant to scare children and fools like me. I didn't believe in monsters. I hadn't, not until that night, until I saw it, or at least glimpsed its outline, moving between the trees, unnaturally tall, unnervingly thin, with eyes that glowed faintly in the flashlight's beam. I stayed up the rest of the night, rifle across my lap, listening to the wind carry whispers through the forest. The sound wasn't wind, not entirely. It had rhythm, intent, like someone was mimicking me, studying me. And then, for the first time, I realized something I had refused to admit. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. And whatever was out there, it had learned patience far longer than I ever could. By morning, the snow around the cabin was marred with more tracks, longer, deeper, closer. I hadn't moved, hadn't stepped outside, and yet there they were, pressed into the earth. I stared at them, my breath fogging the glass. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, to abandon the cabin and the forest altogether. But I knew I couldn't. I had to survive, and to survive, I would have to understand what was out there. And so began my first night of truly knowing I was being hunted. The following day, the forest seemed quieter, almost mocking me with its stillness. Snow crunched under my boots as I patrolled the nearby trails, marking branches and clearing debris, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks. But the footprints remained in my thoughts, long, uneven, disappearing into the depths of the trees where sunlight barely reached. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see movement, but always found only stillness. That night, the whispers returned, faint, guttural sounds drifting through the air like smoke. I gripped my rifle tighter than I had ever done before, scanning the tree line with the flashlight. Shadows seemed to stretch, elongate, as if the forest itself were bending toward me. I caught glimpses of something just beyond the tree line, tall, impossibly thin, hunched in ways no human could manage. It disappeared when I blinked, leaving only the rustle of snow-laden branches. Sleep was impossible. I stayed alert, rotating between the window and the door, checking the traps I had set earlier. Small snares, tripwires, nothing that could stop something like this, but it gave me a sliver of control. I reminded myself constantly, rational fear, trained instinct, calm breathing. And yet the gnawing feeling at the pit of my stomach told me that whatever this was, it wasn't human, and it was learning me. Around midnight, the sounds shifted. No longer whispers or rustling. A dragging noise, like limbs being pulled through the snow. I froze, listening. It circled the cabin, careful, deliberate, slow. I knew it was out there, testing my nerves, gauging my reaction. My rifle rested across my lap. The fireplace crackled softly, offering faint warmth, but it could not fend off the fear. I checked the window again. Footprints, large, spindly, almost skeletal, leading toward the cabin, then circling, leaving the snow pristine as if mocking me. Hours passed. Every snapping branch, every creak of timber set my teeth on edge. I tried to ration my thoughts, to remember that Wendigos were folklore, legends, nothing real. But the pattern of those tracks, the rhythm of the sounds, and the occasional glowing reflection in the dark convinced me otherwise. There was intelligence here, and it was patient. By dawn, I was exhausted, shivering from a mix of cold and fear. The forest outside seemed deceptively calm, hiding its menace behind frosted branches and sunlight glinting off the snow. I knew with a sinking certainty that the next night would be worse, that whatever was out there had learned something from me, my habits, my schedule, my weaknesses. I sat by the fireplace, rifle in hand, staring at the tree line. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run into the forest and never look back. But I couldn't. If I ran, I would be prey. I needed to survive, and survival meant understanding. Understanding meant waiting, watching, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation that I knew, deep down, was coming. Night fell like a heavy curtain, thick and suffocating. The forest around the cabin seemed to exhale, and every creak of timber or whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. I had stopped trying to rationalize the sounds, the movements, the footprints. Something out there was watching, something intelligent, something patient. I gripped my rifle tighter than ever, flashlight angled toward the tree line, and tried to convince myself to breathe slowly. By the second hour, I heard it again, a dragging sound, uneven and deliberate, moving closer than before. It wasn't a creature bounding through the snow like a bear. No, this moved with caution, testing me, measuring me. I didn't dare move. The sound ebbed and flowed, circling the cabin, then retreating, leaving only the soft crackle of snow under some heavy weight. My hands shook uncontrollably, not from cold, but from adrenaline. I tried to remind myself of what I knew. Wendigos were just stories, warnings told around campfires to keep hunters careful. But the tracks, the sound, the glimpses of something long and spindly between the trees, they felt too real to dismiss. I sat by the window, watching the tree line. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending as if the forest itself were alive. And then, for the first time, I saw it clearly. Tall, impossibly thin, hunched, with arms that dragged almost to the ground.
its head tilted at an angle no human should be able to manage. Eyes glimmered faintly in the beam of my flashlight, cold, calculating, unblinking. My chest tightened. I froze, and it froze too, as if testing my reaction. Then, just as quickly, it slipped back into the shadows, leaving nothing but snow and silence. The whispers returned shortly after. This time, not words, just a deep, guttural hiss, a rhythm that felt purposeful. My mind tried to analyze it, but the logic failed. The sound carried intent, intelligence. I knew in my bones that it was learning me, studying every noise, every movement. My rifle and hatchet suddenly felt inadequate. I realized I was being observed not for sport, but for understanding. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep. I paced the cabin, marking the walls with chalk to track time, repeating to myself, "Stay calm, stay alert, don't panic." But the fear gnawed relentlessly at my stomach. Every snap of a branch outside, every rustle of the snow under unseen feet felt amplified, deliberate. By dawn, I understood something chilling. This creature did not need to strike immediately. Its patience surpassed my own, and it was learning. It had learned my habits, my weaknesses, my routine. The forest itself had become a cage, and I was trapped inside with a hunter that had no concept of mercy. I leaned against the wall, rifle ready, flashlight dimmed to preserve my eyes. Whatever this was, I knew I had entered something far older and more cunning than any human threat. And the night was only just beginning.
By the following afternoon, exhaustion weighed on me like lead. I barely slept, but the forest showed no mercy, and neither did the creature. Snow crunched under my boots as I patrolled the immediate clearing, checking my traps and marking anything unusual. The tracks were still there, sometimes fresh, sometimes partially covered by new snow. The patterns suggested intelligence, circling the cabin, testing my perimeter, retreating only to reappear. That night, I decided to reinforce the cabin further. I wedged logs under the door, tied rope to the window latches, and hung bells along the perimeter in case it tried to sneak closer. I knew these measures were trivial. They might not stop a predator of its caliber, but they gave me some control, some illusion of safety. Around midnight, the dragging sounds returned. They were slower now, deliberate, moving from tree to tree around the cabin. My flashlight caught glimpses of it, a tall, unnervingly thin figure slipping between shadows. Its head tilted at impossible angles, and I noticed for the first time its teeth, sharp, jagged, faintly glistening under the moonlight. It didn't attack, it observed. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I stayed put, anchored by the understanding that panic would be fatal. Hours passed. The whispers were constant now, mingling with the wind, low, guttural, almost like laughter. I imagined it mimicking me, testing my patience, and perhaps it was. My mind, frayed by isolation and fear, struggled to discern reality from imagination. Was it just stories come alive, or had I stumbled into something ancient and utterly merciless? By dawn, I was trembling, exhausted beyond measure. My hands cramped from gripping my rifle for hours. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The creature wasn't here by accident. It wasn't curious. It wasn't playful. It was hunting, studying, learning. And the next night would be worse. The next morning, I barely ate. I cleaned my rifle, checked ammunition, and mapped the cabin surroundings meticulously. Every tree, every shadow, every mound of snow was noted in my mind. I started pacing escape routes, thinking of how I could survive if it tried to break in. Night came, darker than ever. The forest seemed alive in ways I had never noticed before. Every shadow stretched unnaturally, and even the moonlight felt insufficient. Then I heard it, a low groaning, moving in a circular pattern outside. My heart raced. The creature wasn't approaching recklessly. It was careful, deliberate, aware of my every reaction. Suddenly, a branch snapped close to the cabin. I trained the flashlight on the sound, and there it was, just beyond the tree line. Taller than any human, limbs too long, fingers dragging through the snow. Its head swiveled unnaturally as it studied me. I realized with a cold clarity that it understood my habits. Every movement I had made over the past nights was catalogued, analyzed, remembered. I whispered to myself, repeating a mantra. I will survive. I am cautious. I am careful. The creature tilted its head, releasing a rasping breath that carried intent, almost mockery. The air seemed to thicken, oppressive, filled with an unseen weight. I couldn't make a sound, not a step, not a twitch. Hours passed. I remained motionless, rifle across my lap, flashlight scanning the tree line. Eventually, the dragging stopped, replaced by a low, intermittent scraping. I knew it had retreated only temporarily, waiting for me to falter, and I knew it was learning, refining its strategy for the inevitable confrontation. Days bled into nights. I stopped keeping track of time. The snow fell relentlessly, covering tracks, hiding movements, erasing evidence. Yet I knew the creature never left. It circled, waited, studied. My patience and vigilance were tested constantly. I kept my rifle at hand, flashlight sweeping the clearing, hatchet close, my mind attuned to the faintest sound. It began to mimic noises, branches breaking, footsteps, even the faint creaks of the cabin. Once I could swear it mimicked my own voice, calling my name softly from the tree line. I froze, heart pounding, realizing that any misstep could give it the advantage. It wasn't simply hunting, it was strategizing, anticipating, learning. I rationed food sparingly. Every movement outside the cabin was calculated. Sleep was brief, if it came at all. My sanity frayed as I realized how small and fragile I was compared to this ancient predator. I wasn't just fighting for survival. I was fighting for awareness, cunning, and patience. The nights had a rhythm now. The creature followed a pattern, circling the cabin in long, slow arcs, sometimes moving closer, sometimes retreating, always observing. I started leaving subtle markers to track its movement, scratches in the snow, small disturbances, objects moved just enough to gauge its approach. On the third night after my improvisations, I saw it fully again. It emerged from the shadows, skeletal and elongated, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. It didn't run or roar. It didn't charge. It simply stared, tilting its head, studying my reactions. I knew then that a direct confrontation would be catastrophic. My rifle, hatchet, and any defenses were trivial compared to its cunning. I began talking aloud, narrating my movements to ground myself. Check the traps, flashlight sweep, rifle ready. My voice trembled, but it helped me cling to clarity. I could feel the creature outside, mimicking me, adapting to every cue. Patience, I reminded myself, calm, observation. Survival depended on strategy. Hours passed. Every sound, the scraping of branches, the faint rustle of snow, was amplified, weighted with intention. I stayed awake, alert, calculating. The Wendigo wasn't just a predator, it was a teacher of fear, and I was learning under its tutelage, unwillingly,
under the looming shadow of death. The nights had become a game of endurance. I no longer slept. I watched. I listened. Every movement in the snow, every whisper carried by the wind, every unnatural shift of shadows was catalogued in my mind. I knew the Wendigo was intelligent, patient, and far older than anything I had faced before. I had reinforced the cabin as best I could, wedging logs under doors and windows, setting up bells and tripwires. They were primitive defenses, but they gave me a semblance of control in a forest that had none. Yet no trap could stop it from observing, from testing, from understanding. One night, around midnight, I saw it again, emerging from the tree line, skeletal and unnaturally elongated, its eyes faintly glowing. It didn't move like an animal, it glided, almost effortlessly, limbs stretching beyond human limits. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, tilting its head, studying me as if I were some puzzle to solve. I held my rifle steady, but my hands were shaking. Its gaze was penetrating, intelligent, and utterly devoid of mercy. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, stay patient, don't react." Hours passed. The creature didn't attack. It simply circled, then retreated slightly, only to return moments later, repeating the pattern. The forest seemed to breathe with it. I could hear the faintest dragging, the softest crunch, the occasional low, guttural sound that echoed across the snow. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but I knew there was no escape. The Wendigo wasn't hunting for food, it was hunting for awareness, testing my reactions, learning my weaknesses. By dawn, I was exhausted but alert. I had a sinking certainty. The confrontation was inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The following day, I attempted to patrol the outer edges of the clearing, marking trees, inspecting footprints, and checking my improvised alarms. Snow fell intermittently, covering the tracks, yet I could feel the creature everywhere, unseen, patient. That night, the dragging noises returned, accompanied by whispers and guttural exhalations. I shone the flashlight across the clearing and caught a glimpse of it, a towering figure, unnaturally thin, moving with deliberate precision. Its head tilted at impossible angles, and the faint glint of eyes reflected the light. It wasn't attacking, it was observing, learning, waiting. Every instinct screamed danger, yet I couldn't leave the cabin. Not yet, not until I understood it, or at least tried. Hours passed in tense silence. I stayed near the window, rifle across my lap, flashlight sweeping slowly. Occasionally, it mimicked sounds, branches snapping, footsteps, even the faint creak of my cabin door. My mind strained to comprehend the intelligence behind it. It wasn't mindless, it was patient, adaptive, strategic. By dawn, I felt hollow, drained, and more aware than ever. Every movement I made, every breath I took, had been observed, and the creature was learning. Days melded together. I no longer counted them. Food was scarce, sleep rarer. I had memorized every inch of the clearing, every shadow and tree line. Still, I could feel the Wendigo outside, circling, patient, learning. It began mimicking my own movements more overtly, footsteps and gestures, almost as if it were mocking me. My heart raced each time I caught it performing something familiar. I realized that a direct confrontation would not be a simple struggle of strength. It would be a battle of cunning, patience, and nerves. One night I saw it fully emerge into the clearing, standing tall, limbs stretched, head tilted unnaturally. Its eyes reflected my flashlight like shards of ice. I froze, rifle raised, aware that any sudden movement could provoke it. I spoke aloud, narrating my actions, grounding myself in strategy. Check traps, sweep the clearing, rifle ready. It tilted its head again, a low hiss escaping its throat, as if approving or mocking my efforts. The dragging resumed, closer now, and I realized the Wendigo had learned my routine, every habit, every movement, catalogued for a confrontation that was surely approaching. By the following night, I had settled into a tense rhythm. I no longer hoped to sleep. My body trembled from exhaustion, yet my mind remained sharp. The creature's intelligence was undeniable. It wasn't a mindless predator. It studied, adapted, predicted. The dragging sounds, the soft whispers, the occasional mimicry of my voice, it all became part of the environment, inseparable from the cold, relentless forest. I watched from the window as it glided between the trees, tall and skeletal, its eyes faintly glowing. It paused, then moved closer to the clearing, tilting its head as though measuring my courage. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, stay patient. Survival depends on awareness." Hours stretched endlessly. Every rustle of snow, every snap of a branch, every breath I took was weighted with intent. The creature wasn't just hunting, it was strategizing, and I was learning, unwillingly, under the cold tutelage of something far older and more cunning than humanity. By dawn, I understood the truth. The confrontation was inevitable. It wasn't a question of whether it would happen, but when, and whether I would be clever enough to survive.
By now, I had stopped measuring days or nights. Time had become a hazy, endless stretch, marked only by the rhythm of the Wendigo's presence. The dragging sounds returned each night, closer, sharper, more deliberate. It was no longer just testing me. It was asserting its awareness, letting me know it could reach me any time. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, logs under doors, ropes on windows, bells strung along the perimeter. They were primitive defenses, but they gave me some semblance of control. Still, I knew instinctively that these measures would only delay the inevitable. The creature was learning, adapting, and it understood far more than I realized. One night, I caught it moving in the clearing, gliding between the snow-covered pines, unnaturally tall, limbs stretched, head tilted like some grotesque sculpture. Its eyes reflected my flashlight, cold and intelligent. I froze, heart hammering, aware that any sudden movement might provoke it. And yet it did not attack. It simply observed, circling the cabin slowly, like a shadow studying its prey. I whispered to myself, narrating my every movement, hoping to maintain some sense of clarity. Check traps, sweep the clearing, rifle ready. The creature responded, almost immediately, dragging limbs closer to mimic the motions I repeated. The realization hit me. It was learning my routine, predicting my actions, preparing for the moment it would strike. Hours passed in agonizing stillness. The forest seemed to breathe with the Wendigo, alive and patient. Every creak, every whisper, every soft crunch in the snow carried intent. I remained vigilant, rifle across my lap, flashlight scanning, ready for anything. By dawn, exhaustion gnawed at me. My body trembled, but my mind was razor sharp. I knew the confrontation was not only coming, it was imminent, and I would need every ounce of patience, cunning, and resolve to survive it. The nights grew longer, the shadows deeper. The forest seemed to twist around the cabin, reshaping itself in ways my eyes could barely comprehend. Each sound, the drag of snow, the snap of branches, the faint hiss of wind, was a calculated signal. The Wendigo was patient, but now I felt a creeping sense of urgency. It was no longer content to observe from a distance. That night I caught it again. Emerging from the tree line, tall and skeletal, it moved with a grace that defied logic. Its head tilted at unnatural angles, and its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. I held my rifle steady, though my hands shook. It studied me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to reveal a weakness. The dragging sounds became a rhythm, circling the cabin, sometimes retreating, sometimes coming closer. I whispered to myself, grounding my mind, "Stay calm, stay alert, stay patient." My flashlight beam danced across the snow, catching glimpses of elongated limbs, teeth glinting, and eyes that reflected predatory intelligence. Hours dragged on, each moment stretching into an eternity. The creature seemed to mimic not just my movements, but my presence itself. It had learned the rhythm of my breathing, the subtle shifts of my stance, even the way I checked my rifle. Survival now depended on vigilance, cunning, and restraint. By dawn, I understood something horrifying. The Wendigo was not merely hunting me, it was teaching me fear. Every night it pushed the boundaries, testing how far it could go, how much I could endure. And yet, in that terrible, bone-deep way, I realized that this knowledge, this understanding, was my only weapon against it. The following evening, I felt it approaching with more intent. The dragging was closer, slower, heavier. It was learning the perimeter of the cabin, the weak points in my defenses, and testing my reactions. I could feel its presence as surely as I could feel the cold in my bones. I stayed inside, flashlight trained on the tree line, rifle ready, hatchet at hand. Every noise was amplified, a branch snapping, snow compressing, distant howls that might have been wind or might have been it calling to me. My nerves were raw, my body ached, yet I remained vigilant, aware that any lapse could be fatal. It came into view again, tall, gaunt, eyes glowing, moving with deliberate grace. I felt a shiver run through me. This time it circled closer than ever, dragging limbs through the snow, head tilting in ways that made my stomach churn. I whispered to myself, repeating every action. Check traps, scan clearing, rifle ready. It mirrored me, mimicking my stance, as if mocking my caution. Hours passed. The night stretched endlessly. I knew the confrontation would come, and I was preparing myself, mentally and physically. My every breath, every movement, every thought was a strategy. I realized that survival would not be about brute force. It would be about patience, cunning, and understanding the predator before it understood me completely. By midnight, the creature's presence was undeniable. Every sound was sharper, every shadow seemed to move independently, and the forest itself seemed alive, complicit with its hunter. The dragging had stopped directly outside the cabin, replaced by low, deliberate breaths, soft whispers, and the occasional snap of a branch. I kept my rifle ready, flashlight sweeping slowly. Then a sound that froze me, a faint imitation of my own voice calling my name from the tree line. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. This was a test. I understood now that the Wendigo wasn't attacking blindly. It was calculating, learning, observing every twitch, every breath, every reaction. The hours stretched endlessly. Its elongated form glided between the trees, eyes reflecting the moonlight. Occasionally it paused, head tilting, as if studying my resolve. My mind was sharpened to every movement, every whisper, every shadow.
The creature was patient, but I had learned to be patient too. By dawn, I realized with chilling clarity the confrontation was inevitable. It was only a matter of time before the creature entered the clearing fully, testing my courage and cunning. The forest, once familiar, had become a prison, and the Wendigo the unyielding warden. My only hope for survival was to anticipate its moves, stay calm, and outthink a predator far older and more cunning than I had ever encountered. That evening, the forest felt different, heavier. The snow underfoot was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I have learned to move silently, to anticipate even the slightest shift in the air. But tonight, the stillness was deceptive. Every instinct screamed that it was closer, waiting for me to falter. I sat near the window, rifle across my lap, flashlight sweeping slowly across the clearing. The dragging sounds returned, low and deliberate, circling the cabin in an unnatural rhythm. I could feel the weight of its gaze through the walls, and every creak of timber made my stomach tighten. It emerged from the tree line, taller than ever, skeletal and gaunt. Its limbs stretched in ways no human body could, and its eyes glowed with that cold, predatory light. I froze, heart hammering. It tilted its head, studying me as I studied it. I whispered to myself, grounding my mind, "Stay calm, observe, survive." It responded with a low hiss, a sound that carried intelligence and menace. I realized with a shiver that it had learned my routine perfectly. Every movement I had made over the past nights was catalogued, understood, and likely manipulated to its advantage. Hours passed. I stayed motionless, counting each breath, each subtle noise in the forest. The creature circled the cabin, dragging limbs through snow, testing my attention, learning my patience. By dawn, exhaustion had clawed deep into my bones, but my resolve remained. I knew the confrontation was imminent.
The next night, I decided to prepare myself differently. I reinforced the doors and windows, gathered extra firewood, and kept the flashlight and rifle at hand. My traps remained as a deterrent, though I knew they would not stop it. They were for me, to remind myself I had some control. As midnight approached, the dragging began again. This time it came closer than ever, stopping just beyond the clearing. I could see the outline of its elongated body, limbs stretching impossibly long. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its glowing eyes reflected the moonlight. It let out a low, rasping sound, like a mixture of breathing and speech. My chest tightened. It was communicating, or testing me. My mind raced. I whispered aloud, narrating my movements, grounding myself in strategy. Check traps, sweep clearing, rifle ready. The creature moved in response, almost mirroring me, as if mocking my caution. Every instinct screamed to react, to shoot, to strike, but I stayed calm. Patience was my only weapon. It was learning me, and I could not give it an advantage. Hours passed. The forest seemed to pulse with its presence, and I realized something terrifying. This wasn't a chase. It wasn't mindless hunting. It was a predator playing a deadly game, teaching me fear, testing endurance, and preparing for the inevitable. By dawn, I knew the confrontation would not wait much longer. My only hope was awareness and cunning.
That night, the air felt suffocating. Every shadow stretched unnaturally, every sound carried weight. The dragging returned, slow and deliberate, circling closer than ever. I gripped my rifle tightly, flashlight sweeping the clearing. It appeared suddenly, gliding between trees, skeletal, limbs stretched, head tilted. Its eyes reflected my beam, cold and intelligent. I froze, heart hammering. This time it did not retreat. It paused at the edge of the clearing, testing me, measuring my resolve. I whispered to myself, recounting everything I knew, the traps, the escape routes, the timing of its movements. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight. The dragging became intermittent, punctuated by low hisses and soft imitations of my own voice. My hands shook, but I did not move. I could not give it an advantage. Hours passed. I remained alert, every nerve taut. The forest itself seemed alive with its presence. I realized then that survival would not depend on strength, nor even weapons, but on patience, cunning, and an understanding of my adversary.
The creature's approach was relentless. Its dragging and whispering carried closer, now accompanied by snapping branches and the faintest creaking of snow. I stayed low, near the window, rifle across my lap. I could feel it circling, testing every weak point, every sound I made. It glided into the clearing fully for the first time, taller and thinner than I had ever seen, head tilted unnaturally. Its eyes glimmered, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, observe, prepare." Hours dragged on. Every sound, the snow, the branches, the wind, was weighted with intent. The creature wasn't hunting randomly. It was calculating, learning, strategizing. I realized with a cold certainty that the confrontation would come, and I would need every ounce of cunning and patience to survive. By dawn, I understood that this was more than survival. It was a test of wits, courage, and endurance, and the Wendigo was the teacher, relentless and ancient, waiting for me to falter.
The night was darker than any before. The snow had fallen heavy, muffling the usual forest noises and leaving the world around me eerily silent. Every shadow seemed alive. Every gust of wind sounded deliberate. I stayed close to the cabin walls, rifle across my lap, flashlight low, and tried to breathe without betraying fear. The dragging sound returned, slower, heavier, almost methodical. It wasn't circling anymore. It was positioning itself, preparing. I caught a glimpse of it moving in the clearing, long skeletal limbs gliding just above the snow, head tilted, eyes locked on me. I froze, barely daring to breathe. For hours I sat motionless, listening. Then came the faint whispering, low, guttural, almost unintelligible. But one word stood out: weak. My stomach turned. It was testing me, assessing my strength, my fear. I whispered under my breath, narrating every motion to stay grounded. Check perimeter, rifle ready, focus. The creature shifted in the shadows, dragging snow toward the cabin. I realized with a shiver that tonight it would no longer simply observe. It was ready to confront, to test my limits, to see whether I would break. The forest seemed alive with anticipation, every tree a silent witness to the game about to unfold.
By midnight, I felt its presence closer than ever. My traps remained silent, bells untouched. The cabin seemed almost too quiet. Then movement, a shadow gliding between trees, limbs stretched impossibly, head tilting unnaturally. Its eyes reflected faint moonlight like shards of ice. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching. I could feel its gaze, heavy and deliberate, assessing my stance, my resolve. Every instinct screamed danger, yet I stayed perfectly still. Patience, I reminded myself. Calm, observation. Survival depended on it. It made a low, rasping sound, more like speech than breath, and it moved closer, testing the boundaries of the snow around the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest, but I whispered aloud, narrating my movements to ground myself. Rifle ready, flashlight low, observe. Hours passed. It circled, gliding silently, each movement deliberate. Occasionally it mimicked me, mirroring my gestures, mocking my caution. By the first faint light of dawn, I understood that this confrontation would define the rest of my life, or end it.
The next night, the creature advanced fully into the clearing, its limbs stretched unnaturally, skeletal fingers dragging snow, head tilted like a grotesque sculpture. I remained near the window, rifle raised, flashlight sweeping slowly. The dragging was intermittent but deliberate, punctuated by low hisses and faint mimicry of my own voice. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, stay patient, observe." The creature responded subtly, dragging closer with every heartbeat. I realized it wasn't hunting blindly. It was calculating, strategizing, testing my endurance. Any reaction could be its advantage. Hours passed. I remained motionless, every nerve taut. My mind was sharpened to every sound, every movement. The forest seemed alive with its presence, the shadows shifting unnaturally as it glided through them. By dawn, exhaustion clawed at my body, but my resolve hardened. The confrontation was no longer imminent. It was inevitable.
By the following night, the tension was suffocating. Every sound in the forest, the dragging, the snapping branches, the faint whispering, felt deliberate. I stayed near the window, rifle across my lap, flashlight sweeping slowly. It emerged fully into the clearing, skeletal and elongated, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its head tilted unnaturally as it studied me, and I realized with cold clarity that it had catalogued every habit, every movement, every breath I had taken over the past nights. I whispered to myself, recounting all I had learned. Traps in place, escape routes memorized, rifle ready, patience. The creature tilted its head and hissed, a sound that carried intelligence, menace, and a promise of the inevitable confrontation. Hours passed like centuries. Its gaze remained fixed on me, waiting, testing, learning. I understood that my survival depended not on strength, but on cunning, patience, and the careful observation of its movements. The forest itself had become a cage, and the Wendigo the unyielding warden. My only chance would be to anticipate it before it could strike. By dawn, I knew that the confrontation, the first true test of courage, cunning, and endurance, was at hand. The hunter was about to be visible, the game about to enter its most dangerous phase. The night was dead silent, yet I could feel it, watching, circling, waiting. I had fortified the cabin as best I could, but deep down I knew nothing would stop it. My rifle rested across my lap, flashlight beam cutting faintly through the darkness. Every instinct screamed that this was the night it would come for me. The dragging sound started again, slower now, deliberate, measured. It was closer than ever before, almost at the edge of the clearing. I held my breath. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself were holding back in anticipation. Then I saw it, skeletal, elongated, taller than any man, gliding effortlessly through the snow. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes reflected the faint moonlight like frozen fire. I froze, barely daring to move. My mind raced. This was no longer a test, it was an attack, and yet it did not rush me. It moved methodically, circling closer, dragging limbs through the snow, making low, guttural sounds. Occasionally it let out a rasp that mimicked my own voice, calling my name softly. My stomach turned. I whispered to myself, grounding my mind. Stay calm, observe, patience. Survival depends on awareness. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight, assessing, analyzing. Hours passed, each moment stretching endlessly. The forest seemed alive with its presence. I realized with a shiver that this confrontation would define my survival, my sanity, and my life itself.
The dragging had stopped, replaced by faint, deliberate breathing just outside the cabin walls. I gripped my rifle tightly, flashlight low but sweeping the clearing in controlled movements. Its elongated figure emerged fully into the moonlit clearing, skeletal limbs stretched, head tilted at impossible angles. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt every nerve in my body tighten. It circled the cabin slowly, calculating, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every instinct screamed to act, to shoot, to strike, but I held myself steady. The creature wasn't rushing. It was learning, adapting, anticipating my every move. Patience was my only weapon. Then came a low hiss, rasping and intelligent. I could swear it was mocking me. The forest seemed to respond, every shadow moving unnaturally, every branch snapping slightly as if in unison with its rhythm. I whispered to myself, narrating each movement, grounding my mind. Check traps, rifle ready, flashlight sweep. Hours stretched, the creature never breaking eye contact. It understood my routines perfectly. It had cataloged my behavior, measured my fear, learned my reactions. I realized with bone-deep certainty that any misstep now would be fatal. By dawn, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was imminent. That night, I resolved to stay awake and alert until the creature made its move. The forest felt oppressive, alive with anticipation. Every snap of snow, every rustle of branches, every faint whisper was magnified. I gripped my rifle tightly, flashlight cutting slow arcs across the snow. Then it emerged again, fully. Tall, gaunt, skeletal, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its limbs moved with impossible grace, gliding over snow, dragging long fingers across frozen branches. Its head tilted at unnatural angles, and I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical presence pressing into me. It circled closer, low, guttural hisses accompanying each step. I whispered aloud, narrating my actions to remain grounded. Observe, stay calm, rifle ready, patience. The creature moved in response, mimicking my stance, my gestures, almost taunting me. The dragging noises grew louder, more deliberate, and I realized with stark clarity that this was no longer testing, it was the beginning of its attack. Survival would not depend on strength, but on strategy, patience, and the sharpest awareness I had ever known. Hours passed. My body ached, exhaustion clawing at every muscle, but I remained focused. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, and I had only myself and my wits to survive it. By the final night, the forest had become a cage. Every shadow, every tree, every gust of wind seemed controlled by the creature. The dragging and whispering had reached their most deliberate form yet, circling the cabin in a rhythm that set my nerves on edge. It emerged fully into the clearing, skeletal, elongated, eyes glowing like faint embers. Its head tilted unnaturally as it studied me, moving with a grace that defied human logic. I gripped my rifle, flashlight sweeping carefully, heart hammering.
The confrontation had begun. It tested the perimeter, dragging limbs closer, tilting its head in ways that made my stomach churn. Every sound I made, every movement was catalogued, analyzed. I whispered under my breath, "Stay calm, stay focused, observe." Hours passed like centuries. Finally, it paused at the edge of the clearing. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath. Its gaze was unwavering, intelligent, and cold. I understood in that moment that this was no longer a test. The creature had decided I was worthy of its full attention. The confrontation, the first true test of survival, courage, and cunning, was inevitable.
The night was blacker than any I had known, the snow reflecting only faint moonlight. I could hear it moving through the clearing, deliberate and confident. The dragging sounds were gone now, replaced by low hisses, soft footsteps, and faint imitations of my own voice. My pulse pounded, every muscle taut, every nerve screaming. I gripped my rifle, flashlight sweeping slowly. There it was, skeletal, elongated, limbs dragging over snow, head tilted unnaturally, eyes glimmering like shards of ice. It paused, just at the tree line, as if studying me, testing my resolve. I whispered to myself, grounding my mind, "Stay calm, observe, survive." This was no longer a game. The creature had chosen to engage. I could feel the weight of its gaze like a physical pressure. Any sudden movement, any mistake, could be my last. Hours passed in tense silence. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of snow, every low hiss was magnified in my mind. Then it moved closer, dragging limbs across the snow, head tilting with deliberate malice. My fingers tightened on the rifle. This was it, the moment I had prepared for, the confrontation that would decide my survival. The Wendigo advanced fully into the clearing. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, fingers brushing the snow, eyes locked on mine. It hissed, low and guttural, a sound that carried intelligence and menace. The forest seemed to close in around me. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to remain calm. My flashlight beam danced across the clearing, sweeping over the creature's skeletal frame. I could see every grotesque detail, the unnatural tilt of its head, the spindly limbs, the faint glimmer of teeth. It circled, calculating, testing me. I whispered my movements aloud, grounding myself. Check traps, rifle ready, patience. It mirrored me subtly, dragging limbs and tilting its head, as if mocking my caution. The snow around the cabin was pristine, except for its tracks, elongated, irregular, unmistakable. I knew it was learning my routine, predicting my actions. Survival depended entirely on remaining calm, aware, and unpredictable. Any misstep, and it would strike. Hours passed. The creature's presence felt unbearable, pressing into me from every shadow. Then, with sudden clarity, I realized this was not just a predator hunting, it was testing, teaching, and breaking down my defenses before the final strike. The confrontation had begun in earnest.
The forest grew silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I could see the Wendigo standing at the edge of the clearing, skeletal and towering, eyes locked on mine. It tilted its head unnaturally, dragging one long limb slowly across the snow. I raised my rifle, finger on the trigger, but did not fire. This was a game of patience, observation, and cunning. I whispered my intentions aloud, rifle ready, flashlight low, observe. The creature responded subtly, shifting, mimicking my stance, testing my focus. Then it lunged, not a rush, but a slow, deliberate advance, limbs stretching impossibly, eyes glowing with intelligence and hunger. I fired, the sound cracking through the silence. The beam of my flashlight illuminated its form, but it did not falter. It paused, then continued, dragging closer. The confrontation had begun in full. Every second stretched into eternity. My heart pounded, yet I forced myself to remain steady, calculating every move, anticipating every advance. The forest had become a chessboard, and I had only one chance to outthink a predator far older and more cunning than any human.
Hours passed in tense combat of wills. The Wendigo circled, lunged and paused, testing me. Every snap of snow beneath its elongated limbs, every low hiss, every tilt of its head was calculated. I responded cautiously, moving only when necessary, firing sparingly, observing constantly. I realized then that strength alone would not win. I had to rely on my cunning, patience, and understanding of the creature. I studied its movements, patterns, and timing, looking for the slightest weakness, the briefest lapse. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I saw it, a flicker of hesitation, its head tilted too far, limbs stretched too thin. My opportunity had arrived. I acted with deliberate speed, firing once, twice, precise shots aimed to disrupt and confuse. The creature recoiled, letting out a low, guttural cry, unlike any sound I had heard before. It retreated into the tree line, dragging itself slowly, limping but alive. The forest fell silent, the tension lifting slightly. I slumped against the wall, rifle still in hand, heart hammering, and realized I had survived, not by brute force, but by patience, observation, and cunning. The Wendigo was gone for now, but I knew it would return. The forest had claimed its space, and I had only proven that I could endure, adapt, and survive. I had faced an ancient predator and lived to tell the tale. And as the sun rose, casting pale light across the snow, I understood the truth. The forest was patient, the Wendigo was cunning, and survival was an endless battle of awareness and courage. The forest remained eerily silent for days after that night. The snow was untouched except for the faint traces of elongated footprints disappearing into the distance. I patrolled the clearing cautiously, rifle in hand, flashlight sweeping constantly. Every tree, every shadow, every sound kept me alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, still studying me. The Wendigo hadn't disappeared, it had simply retreated, biding its time, waiting for me to grow careless. I reinforced the cabin again, adding layers of logs and rope, creating a maze of alarms. But I knew deep down that no barrier could fully protect me. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of wood, every snap of a branch, every gust of wind made me flinch. I realized that survival here was not just physical, it was mental. I had to remain vigilant, aware, and constantly prepared. The forest had become a prison, and the Wendigo its patient warden. I spent the days cataloging everything I had learned, its movements, patterns, intelligence, and patience. I recorded traps, escape routes, and strategies in my journal, mentally rehearsing every possible scenario. Survival required understanding my opponent more than confronting it with brute force. By the end of the week, I understood the truth. The Wendigo was more than a predator. It was a test of endurance, patience, and courage. And I had survived the first chapter, but I knew that the forest and the creature would not forget me.
One night, as a heavy snowstorm rolled in, I heard it again. Not dragging, not whispering, but a low, resonant thrum that seemed to echo through the trees. The sound carried intelligence, as though the forest itself were speaking through the Wendigo. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the darkness. Through the blizzard, I saw its form, skeletal and elongated, gliding over the snow, eyes glimmering with faint, cold fire. It paused at the tree line, head tilted in that unnatural way, assessing me once more. I whispered under my breath, narrating my every movement. Check traps, rifle ready, flashlight sweep, patience. The creature mirrored subtle motions, tilting its head, dragging a limb over the snow, testing my attention. Its patience had not waned. Its intelligence was terrifying. Hours passed. The storm intensified, the wind howling through the trees. I remained still, alert, focused. The creature observed, calculated, and waited. It wasn't hunting for hunger. It hunted for awareness, for understanding, for dominance, and I had learned to endure its tests. By dawn, the storm cleared, leaving a brittle silence. The Wendigo had vanished, retreating into the depths of the forest, but its presence lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of the forest's watchfulness. I realized then that survival was not an event, it was a process, an unending battle of vigilance, patience, and wits.
Days turned to weeks. The forest remained alive with its presence. Every shadow, every rustle, every faint sound reminded me that I was being watched. Sleep was rare, food was scarce, yet I had adapted. I moved with caution, calculated each action, and remained alert at all times. I understood now that the Wendigo was not just a creature of flesh and bone. It was a force of nature, patient, intelligent, and eternal. Confronting it head-on would be foolish. Surviving meant observation, cunning, and respect for the predator. Each night I patrolled the cabin and clearing, flashlight and rifle at hand. Sometimes, in the distance, I glimpsed its form, tall, gaunt, head tilted, eyes glowing faintly in the snow. It always retreated before an encounter, always testing, always learning. I recorded my observations, creating a journal of survival strategies, noting its movements and responses. The forest had become a teacher, cruel and relentless, and I was its student, learning to endure under the shadow of an ancient predator. Months passed. I remained in the cabin, a sentinel in the forest. The Wendigo had not forgotten me, but it had not attacked directly since that first deadly confrontation. It had become a ghostly presence, a shadow that stalked the clearing and tree line, a constant test of awareness and patience. I learned to live with the fear, to move deliberately, to observe and anticipate. Each sound, each shadow, each whisper of wind became data, a signal of the creature's continued vigilance. Survival was no longer about fleeing or fighting. It was about understanding, endurance, and respect for a predator older than memory. And yet, even in the rare moments of calm, I knew it could return at any time. The forest was its domain. I was merely a visitor, tolerated, tested, observed. My journal remained close, my rifle ready, my senses alert. I understood that survival was not a final victory. It was a momentary reprieve. As the sun rose over the snow-covered forest, casting pale light through the skeletal pines, I realized that I had endured, adapted, and survived. The Wendigo had tested me, but I had lived. The forest was patient, the creature was eternal, and I had learned to exist under its shadow. and in that knowledge, a quiet, uneasy peace settled over me. I was not safe, but I had survived. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I could hear it moving through the tree line, a reminder that the forest was never truly empty, and that I was never truly alone.